Right, so hello, welcome back to Books and Things. Today I'm going to be doing my February wrap-up and talking about all the books I read in February. All things considered, it wasn't a bad reading month. I got through 10 books in February, which I think is not too bad, but I did fail on one book, which I was supposed to read this month and failed to, but more on that in a minute. I will start off, as usual, with my monthly challenges. As you may remember from my 2016 reading resolutions video, I'm trying to read a non-fiction book every month this year, and this month I read 2, so I'm feeling very, very proud of myself for that, and I enjoyed both of them massively. So The Invisible Woman by Claire Tomalin is a biography of a woman called Ellen Ternan. Now, Ellen Ternan was the mistress of Charles Dickens for about 10 years, the last 10 years in fact of Dickens's life. And this book basically tells the story of her life from her birth to her death, including those 10 years that she spent with Dickens. Nellie Ternan is a fascinating historical figure and character in many ways. She was effectively erased from history by Dickens and by herself. She was with Dickens and lived in a house provided by him, often with him, for 10 years. And then after Dickens's death, she literally erased those 10 years of her life and pretended that she was 10 years younger than she was, and went on to live a life in which no one ever knew that she'd had anything to do with Dickens. And it was only after Dickens's death, and in fact quite a while after Ellen Ternan's death, that all this and their relationship began to come out. The way Claire Tomalin builds on the history we have to kind of try and present a picture of what life might have been like for Ellen is really, really brilliant and very well done. This book was also made into a film, but the film is more like a fictionalised version of this non-fiction book. I do have a few problems with this though. There are two main problems I have. One is something I actually found in Claire Tomalin's biography of Jane Austen too, in that I think her history is really good, but I don't really credit much of her literary criticism. She talks quite a bit in this about Dickens's attitudes towards women in his life and in his fiction, and she talks quite a lot about Dickens's presentation of women in his books, and Claire Tomalin does it like, basically she reduces it massively. It's very, very, very oversimplified, and she really kind of discredits a lot of the subtlety in Dickens's presentation of women in his later works. She really discredits a lot of characters that I actually think are quite interesting, and she bases Dickens's narrative presentation of women on his central female characters and kind of ignores the female characters who are not the central heroines, who to my mind tend to be a bit more interesting and a bit more complex. The other problem I had was that basically there are two ways you can read Charles Dickens and Nellie Ternan. You can either view it as a couple who fell in love and were together in the only way that they could feasibly be together in the Victorian society that they lived in, or you can read it as an older man taking advantage of a vulnerable younger woman. Charles Dickens was more than 20 years senior to Ellen Ternan, and Claire Tomalin really, really bigs up their age difference and kind of implies that they therefore must have had a relationship which was like part romantic relationship and part like father-daughter, and she makes it really creepy, and she tries really hard to kind of make this not a glamorous love affair, which is obviously important because it obviously wouldn't have been, and many aspects of Ellen Ternan's life would have been very hard, many aspects of their relationship would have obviously been very hard, but she basically, for me, I think she takes it a bit too far the other way, and she basically implies that Dickens was preying on this young woman and that Nellie didn't feel any romantic attachment to Dickens, and I don't think that we know that. I don't know really, but the way she presented their relationship kind of bugged me and felt a little bit, she made it a bit too creepy, and I don't think we know that it was that creepy, if that makes sense. Regardless, it's a really, really interesting book, and I'd like to read her biography of Charles Dickens now because I'm curious to see what she says about all of his life. And the other non-fiction book I read this month was SPQR by Mary Beard. So SPQR is a history of the Romans. It's basically a history of Rome from when it was founded up until the 2nd century CE. SPQR stands for a Latin phrase that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that means the Senate and the people of Rome. I found this book so engaging. I don't really know much about Roman history, but I still found it really accessible and really, really interesting, very fascinating. What I really like that Mary Beard does is she does talk a lot about the kind of political stuff going on at the time, but she also takes time out to talk about social history. She does do her best to kind of examine what life was like for everyday people in Rome at the time, and that I found especially fascinating and really good. Just a really interestingly written book as well, and I found it really enjoyable. I knew next to nothing about Roman history before reading this, and I still really enjoyed it. I do think I might have got a tiny bit more out of it if I had known a bit more about Rome, even just vaguely, because there are a few points where I was kind of confused by the chronology and stuff. But at the same time, I think SPQR is probably also really interesting if you do know lots about Roman history. My boyfriend Nick recommended it to me, and he knows a lot more about Roman history than me, and he still really enjoyed it as well. I listened to this on audiobook. The audiobook that is an Audible for this is really good, and all in all, I really enjoyed SPQR, and I'm really enjoying non-fiction at the moment. So this month, I also picked out 2 books from my TBR bowl, which if you haven't seen it before, looks like this and has an awful lot of paper in. The first book I picked out was Not the End of the World by Kate Atkinson, which is her short story collection. I read Life After Life like almost 2 years ago now, and I thought it was so utterly incredible. I was so excited to read this, and it did not disappoint. It was brilliant. I actually did this as a buddy read with Lauren from Lauren and the Books. I will link her channel down below. You should definitely go and watch her videos if you haven't yet. She is hilarious and brilliant. We both thoroughly enjoyed reading this, and it was really nice to discuss it as we were going along. How we paced this was we read just one story a day, and then we like talked about it on Voxer. I think this short story collection is really interesting. Some of the stories are a bit magical realism. There's one or two which are a bit kind of post-apocalyptic, and what I think Kate Atkinson does so well, which I also found in Life After Life, is she describes the abnormal like it's normal in the most beautiful way. I think my favourite story was Unseen Translation, which is about a nanny and the boy she's looking after, and I just thought both of their characters were done so well and built so brilliantly. It's just, yeah, great. I love Kate Atkinson. I love the way she writes. I'm so excited to read more by her. But the other book I pulled out of my TBR bowl this month was Gardens of the Moon by Stephen Erickson, which is a fantasy book that my brother lent me ages ago and has very strongly recommended to me. And I kind of failed. I am all of about 10 pages through. I am reading it at the moment, and I am going to continue reading it, but I thought I had much more time than I did, and then I remembered that February is short and I haven't read this, but I'm going to read it next month. But yeah, I didn't read this month. I failed. I'm sorry. Also, every month, as well as my TBR bowl, I pick out a reading challenge from this bowl, which my friend Celine made for me. So my reading challenge for this month was to read a book that someone else picks out for you, in brackets Celine. So I asked my friend Celine what book I should read for February, and she lent me this, which is Jojo Moyes' Me Before You, and I'm very glad she lent this to me, because I'm not sure I would have necessarily picked it up if she hadn't spoken about it and recommended it to me. However, this was very interesting and really emotionally engaging, like very emotionally engaging, be warned. This tells the story of a young woman called Louisa Clark. She's about 26, and she's been working in a cafe for many years. She really enjoys it, and then the cafe shuts down. She has to get a new job. She ends up working as a carer for a disabled man named Will, and the book is basically about their relationship and how they affect each other's lives. There are a couple of bits where I feel like the writing was a tiny bit overdone, but I found the characters so interesting and the plot so engaging and so thoroughly moving that I kind of forgave it for that, because this is a really beautiful and moving book. I did cry lots. I enjoyed it very much, so yes, there we go. Well done, Celine. It's a good recommendation. I approve. This month I also read City of Ashes by Cassandra Clare, which is the second book in the Mortal Instruments series, which is part of the Shadow Hunter series. I've read the Infernal Devices trilogy before, and I've also read the first one in this trilogy. I did really enjoy this. I thought it was good fun. I did this as a buddy read with Melissa from the Bookish Babbler. I will link her channel down below. It is so good. You should definitely go and watch her videos, and we both really enjoyed this. We had fun kind of discussing things and getting very excited over Goodreads when we were talking about this. As always with Cassandra Clare, her writing is incredibly engaging, and I got through this very fast. She writes in a way that really does pull you in right from the beginning. I still don't like the Mortal Instruments trilogy as much as I like the Infernal Devices trilogy, but that doesn't mean I don't enjoy them, and there are some characters I like, particularly Simon and Luke. Clary I don't like as much as Tessa and Jace. I struggle with Jace at times, but then there's Alec and there's Magnus, and I'm happy, and it's beautiful. I also read One for Sorrow, Two for Joy by Clive Woodall a while back around New Year. My boyfriend lent me about 12 books. Not that I need any more books, but you know, why not? I'm never going to say no to books. Most of these books were books that he loved as a child, and he couldn't believe that I had not read when I was younger and had missed out on, so I've been slowly working my way through them and enjoying most of them, some of them more than others. This was one of the ones I liked less than some of the others. One for Sorrow, Two for Joy is basically about the bird kingdom. Basically, the magpies in the kingdom of birddom are basically slowly exterminating all other species of birds, and this book is about a robin and an owl and a few other birds trying to like fight back against the magpies. I didn't like it. I didn't hate it as much as I hated The Call of the Wild, which Nick also recommended to me last month. Sorry, Nick. I think for me, I find it hard reading books with animal protagonists. I do find that harder, and I do think if this book had had the same plot and it had been like elves in a fantasy world or some kind of dystopian society, I would have enjoyed it more. It's a weird book because in many ways it reads like a children's adventure story. Like the plot is kind of like a simple adventure setup, and most of the characters are sort of black and white, good or evil. But then there is some very graphic violence, and there is one quite violent, brutal rape scene, and that's quite shocking for a book that feels like it's a children's book. To deal with those kind of themes of rape and murder and genocide, which this book does, in the form and the structure with the writing it has, just doesn't really sit together for me. Like, certain aspects of the book felt too childish for a book dealing with the themes it deals with, which I found a bit weird. But the other book I read this month that Nick had recommended to me was Buried Fire by Jonathan Stroud, which I absolutely adored. I've spoken before on this channel about the Bartimaeus trilogy by Jonathan Stroud, which I also think is brilliant. I think he's one of the best children's writers or writers for young people within the last 15 years. I think his writing is brilliant. This is quite different from the Bartimaeus trilogy in that this is set in our world as it is. The book is set in an English village. It begins with a young boy, Michael, who's about 13, falling asleep on a hillside and waking up to find that he has gained some kind of mysterious powers. At the same time, an ancient cross is dug up in the churchyard and the local vicar is kind of overseeing this. I just thought, the way it characterises this small English village amongst this kind of weird fantasy stuff that's going on in the background was just brilliant. I thought it was really funny but also really touching and just really cool. Just a thoroughly great story. I also read Even the Dogs by John McGregor. As I have mentioned before, John McGregor is one of my favourite living authors. I actually read this straight after I'd read One for Sorrow, Two for Joy because I hadn't massively enjoyed that book and I wanted to read something that I knew I would definitely enjoy. Maybe enjoy is the wrong word though. This is quite a harsh, brutal, heartbreaking book in many ways, but it is so utterly brilliant and beautiful. John McGregor's writing just astounds me every time I read anything by him. He's just like the goal in life, the writing goal, because I just can't imagine any writing greater than his. It is so utterly beautiful and incredible. It's great. This book begins with the police breaking down the door of someone's flat and finding the occupier dead on the floor. The rest of the book then follows the people that this man knew. Most of the central characters in this book are either homeless and drug addicts. It deals with the people left right at the bottom of society. It is a heartbreaking, powerful, brilliant book. It is so well written. I just can't explain. His writing is so good. Please go and read something by him. Please. This book just broke me slightly, but it's so good. You see, this is what I mean. John McGregor is incredible. He broke me in 192 pages. It's just brilliant. It's so good. Okay, next book. Of course, what month would be complete without a Victorian read? This month I read Sybil by Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli, if you don't know, was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom twice in the 19th century. He was a novelist and then he was Prime Minister because the Victorian period was cool. Sybil, or The Two Nations, is an industrial novel from the 1840s. It follows two central characters. One is Mr. Egremont, who has had a very privileged upbringing. He is upper class, he is a gentleman. He is about to become an MP when by chance he gets a glimpse of what life is like for a lot of other people who are not as privileged as him. It kind of changes his view on the world, and part of the reason why this change comes about is he meets this young woman from a working class family called Sybil, who is one of those female angels of Victorian literature where you could just see the literary halo above her head. I found Sybil really engaging. I've heard mixed things about Benjamin Disraeli's writing actually, so I wasn't that sure how much I would like it, but I really enjoyed the writing and the narrative. I found it really engaging. I found it a really enjoyable read. He deals a lot with the relationship between the rich and poor in Britain at that time. So the book is called Sybil or The Two Nations. It has two different titles, and The Two Nations is supposed to refer to the two nations within Britain, the rich and the poor. At times Disraeli's moral aims and the things he is trying to put across through his book become a little bit clunky and a little bit paternalistic as well. There's on one hand a great feeling of how much the poor are suffering, but on the other hand there's also a great feeling of this idea that the poor probably don't know what's best for them, which is, yeah, it's complicated. I think it was a really interesting, fascinating novel, and most of the industrial novels I have read are a tiny bit later and set a little bit later. So Sybil was written in 1845, I believe, but some of it is set in sort of 1837. So it deals very interestingly with a lot of problems with the Industrial Revolution and a lot of the way that many skilled craftsmen who were used to working with their hands had kind of lost their jobs with the growing use of machines in factories. That kind of thing I found really interesting. Personally, I don't think Disraeli does the industrial novel as well as Elizabeth Gaskell. I don't think anyone does the industrial novel as well as Elizabeth Gaskell. So if you want to read a novel about industry in the 19th century, go and read Mary Barton or North and South. But if you have read Mary Barton and North and South and found them very interesting, especially from an industrial perspective, I think you will enjoy Benjamin Disraeli's Sybil. Finally, this month I also read a poetry collection, which was For and After by Christopher Reid. I'm trying to read more poetry because I really like it, but I always forget about it. And this month I joined the Poetry Library on the South Bank. You can see here, this is from the Poetry Library. If you live in London and like poetry, definitely join the Poetry Library. It is in the Royal Festival Hall and the South Bank. It is free to join if you have a UK permanent address. It's really, really good, has a really wide range. I've previously read Christopher Reid's The Scattering, and I thought it was incredibly beautiful and moving. I read it several years ago, and there are still some lines I distinctly remember from it in my head, even though I've only read it once and a while ago, because it was so utterly powerful. So I was really interested to read another thing by him. I kind of picked this up just from his name. I didn't know much about the collection. It's quite an odd collection, actually, because it is made up of poems that are either for or after. So half the poems in this book are dedicated to various like friends and fellow poets of Christopher Reid, and then the other half of the poems in this book are like after people, so they're kind of reworkings, retellings, or translations of classical or foreign poems. For me, I much preferred the for poems than the after poems. I much preferred the dedications than the retellings. I think that's just because of the style of Christopher Reid's poetry that I prefer, but I did really enjoy the collection overall. I thought it had a lot of really interesting, lovely poems in, and I'm looking forward to reading more poetry in the future. Let me read, this was my favourite one I think, Bermudapest, for Clarissa Upchurch and George Setez. A place I've never been, but which, at the back of my mind's eye, I know I've seen, is stately apartment blocks beginning to melt in the mid-morning blaze, its beach cafes loud with the laughter of chess players and philosophers, and there's the postcard view, you'll know it, down an avenue of lolling palms where the imperial cavalry once wheeled and stamped and jangled under the indolent scrutiny of a poet, who, turning to his guitar, strummed the first bar of his improbable epic, the high tones of history flavoured with a peppery patasse. A nonchalant beat added to old gypsy sorrows. A good place to meet, I feel, and clink a glass or two of something sombre as ink, with a paper parasol in it. Let's get on a plane and go there. Tomorrow's? So yes, there we have it. That was my February of reading. I hope you have enjoyed my February wrap-up. Please let me know, as always, down in the comments if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them. I'll be back on Thursday with another video. In the meantime, happy reading. So it wasn't a bad reading month. Oh, my pictures really, really squint.